Zach, we're back talking about rookie draft strategy, moves to be making during your rookie draft, the strategy to implement within rookie drafts. We got a bunch we're going to throw at you guys today. And Zach, I can't wait to kick it to you. How are we navigating our rookie drafts? What kind of strategies are we looking to implement? And why are these so important to ultimately lead to winning our rookie draft, regardless of the hauls we take? What are the best strategies that we're implementing and things we're focusing on in these rookie drafts? So, Zach, I'm going to kick it to you first. I want to hear the first thing you're kind of looking at.
This sounds so obvious, but it's very important to know your league scoring format and also your starting roster formats because there's a huge difference in PPR leagues and then tight end premium leagues where the tight ends are being awarded 2 points per reception or 1.75 points per reception or even 1.5. Like that difference in that half point scoring for that tight end is huge in variance in terms of ADP. Let's talk specifically Dalton Kincaid. That could change Dalton Kincaid to an end of the first round pick to say 107 or 108 in Superflex drafts right after those first 6 ahead of those other 3 wide receivers we're talking about. So knowing your league scoring formats is really important to knowing ADP. Obviously, this doesn't even like one quarterback Superflex. That's obvious at this point, but also know your starting roster format. If it's start 12, you need to have more players to start. So maybe acquire some later draft picks as opposed to if it's start 8 and you need to have a loaded roster full of studs. So know your league scoring format and know your starting roster format as well. Don't just try to accumulate as many players as possible when you can only start 8.
I mean, that's just something that reigns so true. In everything you do in a league, you should always have the format in mind because that affects trades, that affects the startup draft, as we discussed, and obviously then it also boils into rookie draft. So, absolutely something to focus on. I love it. It's a great start. That should be absolutely the first thing you consider when you're going to your rookie draft, keeping that format in mind. It's something easy to kind of forget about, especially when that rookie fever hits and you get all excited about rookie picks and things like that. Speaking of getting excited about picks, the first point I have is paying attention to the board. I know all of my drafts are slow drafts. I do most of mine with no time limit, just because I want to, invite as many trade opportunities as I can. But I say pay attention to the board because you never know how it's going to fall. You can't predict player reaches, player slides, and things like that. All you can do is react to what's happening with best process in mind and be ready for when it eventually happens and have the relationship that you always discuss with your league mates. Have that relationship so you can kind of, be in that inbox and be ready to get a trade done. And if you are following really good process and you kind of have a good vibe for what each team might need ahead of time, you could be the first one to send that trade offer to move up as needed. Had this happen in one of my rookie drafts this past weekend where CJ Stroud slid to the 107. And I knew this guy, he had been hounding me for Deontay Johnson for months. So I sent him Deontay Johnson, the 203 for the 107. It was a done deal, lickety split. So keeping things in mind like that for, not only paying attention to the board and seeing when things fall, when the inevitable fall happens or the inevitable reach happens and pushing someone else down the board to maybe somebody you can more easily trade with, or you have kind of that target in mind, having something in place or an idea in place where you can run to that manager and get that offer in their inbox as soon as possible and get that trade up before somebody else seizes the opportunity. Zach, feel free to touch on this topic or touch on your next one.
Yeah, I mean, listen, paying attention to your board it's so paramount, especially if you're in a position to target certain players. I think it's more important than as opposed to if you're rebuilding and maybe just letting the best player fall to you. So it really, for me, that depends on what the situation of my team is. Because if I'm a piece away as a championship contender, and I see a piece fall 1 or 2 spots more than it should, then I'm going to go get that piece. Or as you say, just soak up the value of a quarterback falling lower than it should. For me, you just briefly touched on this, but I'm big on, and this being in the league with me, Bob, is just cultivating relationships within the league, but having these conversations prior to the draft. And that is just because a lot of people might want to trade out. And they will go, well, I had this conversation with so-and-so beforehand. I'll give you a great example. I'm at 112 in one league. It's a 1.75 PPR league for tight ends. And I was trying to move up to 109 to get Dalton Kincaid because I know he's not going to last till 112. And actually, the guy made the pick. He made the pick of Dalton Kincaid and then went back to me in the conversation and was like, hey, I remember that you wanted this Is this who you want? I'm like, absolutely. That's who I wanted. And I ended up making a trade for Dalton Kincaid, even after the pick had been made, because I had that conversation prior to. So it's just finding out where other people, like, don't be afraid to ask who people are picking. I do it all the time, especially when I'm trading down and I'm trying to inchworm, which we'll talk about later. Like, who are you taking here? Because I'm just trying to trade down 3 spots and I want to make sure my guy's there. If not, I'll just take my guy. But I'm not afraid to ask, who are you drafting? Who are you targeting here? And I even do that. So if I'm at 110 or whatever position, talk to the person in front of you. What are they thinking? So let me start to gather my game plan based around what this person says. It doesn't necessarily have to be if I want to trade with this person. It can be I want to make my draft plan. Do I see the player falling to me that I'd like as a value, or do I see a situation where I could potentially trade down from here, and maybe I need to start having these conversations with the teams below me? So just cultivate those relationships and have those conversations before the draft. This is not a February conversation. This is a post NFL draft to your rookie draft conversation. So, or like day one of the NFL draft happens, your rookie draft's on Sunday. I'm having those conversations Thursday night. Hey, what are you thinking? Where do you want to go? So on and so forth. So just don't be afraid to talk to your league mates.
Yeah, I think a running trend throughout this entire video will be to the more work you do leading into your draft, the easier your draft will go. The more, groundwork you set for yourself, you'll be that much more set to go for your rookie drafts when the time comes. And speaking of that, something I learned, we share a league together, and I was desperately trying to get into the second round the entire draft. I think there's so much good value in the second round of rookie drafts. I had no second round picks, and I was just every time a pick was made, I was like, all right, well, I got to go talk to this next guy now. And it is so damn hard to trade into a rookie draft, especially if you're not like using picks to move up, because the value inflation on rookie picks is so much higher than veteran talent at the moment. Until your rookie draft comes and goes, that's just how it is. Rookie draft picks have so much more value than they probably should. I will say, while it's hard to trade in, if you're willing to trade out, there is great value to be had, because you can gain veteran talent at a supreme discount right now. If you're a competitive team, these rookie, and we've touched on this a lot through the pre-draft process, that maybe making the rookie pick isn't what's best for your team. You can get some great talent for some of these, draft picks. Instead of drafting, one of the exciting young rookie wide receivers, Jordan Addison, Zay Flowers, Quentin Johnson at 107, you could package that 107 up with some other pick and go try to get someone like Najee Harris. If you're a competitive team, Najee Harris helps you a hell of a lot more. And not saying that other team isn't competitive. That's obviously going to be something that plays a role. But, if you're willing to trade out with how inflated the rookie draft pick value is, it's definitely something I highly recommend exploring, because as a competitive team, you might just be able to get some of these better players. And I'm not saying like trade out of players that are going to be more than likely early producers like Bijan, like Jahmyr Gibbs. But instead of drafting a rookie wide receiver, like I said before, who's likely to have some speed bumps year one, I'm definitely exploring some trade out options as much as I can, because I do believe that I can get more productive value for at least that rookie season of that rookie player, that I might be able to later, once that player produces, and, let's say I have adequate depth, I can flip that piece later for a rookie pick again to kind of rinse that cycle. If I don't need that player, if I don't think that player's value is going to continue on through the offseason, whatever the case is. But highly recommend, anytime you're up to pick, I'll talk about this later, definitely be open to accepting taking offers, at least for picks. But Zach, you're up next. Feel free to touch on what I just did or dive into your next one.
I mean, for me, this is very important, and I am starting to see this more as I think a lot of us together gain dynasty experience, but it's have your plan and know your plan going into the draft, because you mentioned a word earlier that is 1,000% a true thing, and that's rookie fever, or we could also call that FOMO, fear of missing out, right?
Yep.
Just because you don't draft a player now doesn't mean you won't have access to them later. You might have access to them later in the draft. You might have access to them after the draft. You might have access to them in a year from now. You don't know. So don't let this become emotional and know your process with your team. Where is your team at? Are you in a rebuild? Have you just started a rebuild? Is it going to be 2 to 3 years? Then maybe you need to. If you are at the beginning of a rebuild, your number one priority should be to acquire more draft picks next year. Hands down. If you're in a championship window and you need one piece, go get that one piece. Don't be afraid to move up the board. I know that you and I, Bob, we talk a lot about moving down the board, but there are situations where it's right to move up, like you just said with CJ Stroud, like I just said with Dalton Kincaid. Know your plan, know how to get there. You should have scouted the drafts, the strengths of the draft class, the weaknesses of the draft class, estimated ADP prior to. How do you do that? You get into our Discord, and you do the mock drafts with us every single week, like we've been doing for 4 months now. And sometimes they're not even us. They're just patrons in there. Hey, I want to do a mock draft. You get in there and you do. It takes 20 minutes to do a mock draft. So it's just know your plan and know how to get there. Use this. The draft is your biggest vehicle to improvement other than trade. So how are you going to utilize this vehicle to get to where you need to be? If it's a rebuild, for me, it should always be about next year. Because if you're rebuilding, you're not competing in 2023, right? You shouldn't be rebuilding and then 3 months later be like, oh, I'm competing. That's not how plans work. You don't just change course like this. You know when you're going to compete. You know when it's time to rebuild. So know your plan, stick to it, and do not become emotional on draft day because you have FOMO with a player.
I think this kind of leads very well into this next point, because I've had this before in drafts where I've made the mistake of there's a player I really want that falls to my pick. I waited however long to have this player fall. But even if exactly who you want falls to that pick, I think it's always wise to take out offers with the pick on the clock, because you never know who's going to blow your doors off with a great offer. You never know that somebody's going to be willing to trade up one spot to maybe not even grab the guy you wanted. And then you can get, just a little bit of extra value, especially if you're in a rebuild. Every bit of extra value helps. And maybe they take your guy, but, we'll get into some more points that having a mindset, like you said before, of, where you're happy with taking players and things like that plays a role later. The worst thing you can do in a rookie draft is the second you're on the clock, draft. I think that's the worst thing you can do, because I think you're missing out on a ton of potential value. You're going to touch on this, so I won't murder it. But, definitely look for offers, look for trade downs. I'll talk about this a little bit more with my next topic as well. After you get into one of, I would say, the most important topics in rookie draft strategy, along with startup draft strategy. I think this is very important in both formats. Zach, why don't you talk about this point?
Yes, we've always talked about this, Bob, and it's called the inchworm strategy. Maybe we could put a little inchworm across the screen or something like that. That'd be cool.
Do it.
We should make T-shirts, the inchworm strategy. And I'll give you examples of how I employed this in one of our recent drafts, a league that I'm in with you, Bob. But it's if you need more volume, be flexible to move down the draft board, but only so much, because you can maximize the value only moving down 4 or 5 or 6 spots. So I'll give you an example. I'm going to read you some trades. I did this with the league with you, Bob. We just finished our rookie draft. I had the 201 in that league. I moved the 201 for the 205, 306, and a 24 third. So I just turned one asset into 3. Okay. Sweet. That's one trade. I chose somebody with the 205, and then I turned the 209 into the 302 and a third round pick with you. Yes. So I've now turned one asset into 5 assets, just in that scenario right there. Now, those were 2 separate. Actually, I turned 2 assets into 5 because I already had 201 and 209 to start, but I also made a draft pick at 205. So, utilize this strategy to just move down the board a little bit at a time and accrue more, in this case, volume. And that's what I wanted. It's a deep league. There's really no waiver wire in this league. And the only way that you're going to fill up that roster is either trading or drafting all those players. So I chose to give myself more volume later in the draft this year and later in the draft next year. Utilize that strategy if you can. It does start to get hard when you get in similar tiers. For example, in a super flex league, it's difficult to move off of 107 to 109, because at 109, when you got those 3 wide receivers after the first 6, we're talking Zay Flowers, Quentin Johnston, and Jordan Addison. 109 is probably just going to take whoever drops to them. And that's going to happen sometimes, and there's nothing you can do about it. You might have to move out of a tier, and that's okay. If you need that volume, if this is a start 8 league, this strategy makes no sense, especially in a rookie draft. It makes more sense in a startup draft, but the inchworming down the draft board provides you with more opportunities, more dart throws, and more volume for your overall roster.
And I'll be honest, I don't think the assumption should be made, because this is my next point, is using your tiers. And I say use your tiers because you might not have those 3 wideouts in the same tier as I do. Those could be split up. And while players are going to be in tiers, there's still going to be some preference on who you'd rather have in the tier, just based on, maybe your favorite team, or maybe you're just really in on this player, but you can acknowledge that they have similar value. But I'm saying use your tiers, because this piggybacks very well off your point. Is if you get on the clock, take that time, see where your tiers are at. Is there 4 picks yet that's the same tier for you, and you can move back those 4 picks and gain some value? Because in that case, you should. Picking at the top of a tier, and I say top of a tier like the beginning of a tier grouping as it's coming down the board, not ranking in a tier or anything like that. But the only benefit to picking at the top of a tier at the beginning of a tier is to pick your guy out of that tier. But when you take, like you said before, take the emotion out of it a little bit, stick to the pure, I'm focused on the production value and the perceived value of this player when I'm making this draft pick. Be willing to take the time and navigate down the board that little bit, because there could be somebody that has X player in a tier above you that's ahead of this tier, that they think they're at the very end of a tier, that they think a tier break is coming. But you, being the smart Dynasty players that you are following this channel, sorry to self-plug like that, but you know better to have tier set up that way that you can trade back to the bottom of your tier, the end of your tier, get a similarly valued player with additional draft capital on top. Again, the only value to being at the top of the tier is to pick your guy or to pick your preference, whatever that might be. But at the end of the day, I'm always going to try to work my way back to the end of the tier if I can. Obviously, you can only do so much, like you said before. Sometimes there just won't be somebody who wants to trade down with you, or trade up with you so you can trade down. But always going to always going to try to take that time, just like you are, Zach, with your next point.
Yeah, you talked about this earlier. Typically, these drafts, especially if they're happening in May, should be slow drafts. I will never participate in a fast rookie draft. I will make damn sure about that. But I've never heard of it in May. I've never heard of it. So these drafts should be slow drafts. Do not let your league mates peer pressure you into making a selection. It's your time. It's your time for a reason. It's to allow you to go through your process of who's on the draft board, who are potential trade targets, and to have those conversations if you want to move up or do you want to move down, which then somebody else would be on the clock if you're trying to move up. But if you want to move down, you're allotted this amount of time to have those conversations. Typically, it's an 8-hour clock, 24-hour clock, or untimed. You are allowed to go through your process. You are allowed to wait for somebody else who may be in a different time zone to get off work and engage you in that conversation. You do not have to rush the draft. I know it sucks for the rest of the league. That is not your problem. Your problem is your team, and you're trying to win money. Don't let anybody peer pressure you. So if you need to take 7 hours and 30 minutes of that 8-hour clock, sucks to be everybody else in that league. But you have to do right by you, because hopefully this is an opportunity for you to grow your team one way or the other, whichever direction your path is, whether you're rebuilding, whether you're contending. This is your opportunity to get it right, and you don't rush it because everybody else in the league is trying to peer pressure you into that.
When you're in these leagues with these, people from all over the world, we're in a Rewinders league where we have people spread out all over the state, or all over the country, and we have people over in Europe and Spain. So I guess Spain is in Europe, but we have people all in Europe and I believe Africa as well. I think Chris is from Africa. So we have people all over the globe right now, which is totally awesome. Absolutely. Don't be afraid to take the clock to make the best process you can, and, work those trade downs if they're there. 100% agree. Take the time. This is absolutely the time of year where you've built yourself up, hopefully before the draft, to a point where you can make your team exponentially better, set yourself up that much more for the future, get an influx of rookie talent or get an influx of future draft capital, whatever the case is. Don't be afraid, like you said, Zach, to use that clock. Moving on to my next point. I am far more likely to trade down in a draft. I think you are as well. But I think trading up always has to be on the table, especially when you're in a draft where you're not necessarily starting 10 plus players. You're starting, 7, 8, 9 is kind of in the middle. You have to be cognizant of the situation because I've seen a lot of comments lately in the YouTube comments that always, who should I take at 209 or like who should I take at 202? I also have pick 209, but I need this. And like the need makes more sense for, being in that late first where you can get to, a Jordan Addison, a Zay Flowers, a Quentin Johnston. And I'm like, navigate, try trading up. If you, there's no necessarily, unless you're in a deep league, like we've alluded to, starting 10 plus, I don't think there's necessarily a ton of value in just waiting for the pick to come down the board. I think whether you're rebuilding, whether you're contending or somewhere in the middle, there are going to be times where it just makes more sense to trade up, not even just when there's a player falling, but to get to a better value that makes more sense for your team, something I know you're going to talk about with this next pick of yours or this next topic of yours. I just think that while we always are going to advocate or discuss the trade down because we love building that asset pool, there does come a time where it just makes more sense for your team and your roster build, whether you're trying to, just get better players on your roster. Because at some point, regardless of your roster size and allocation, starting allocations and things like that, you're just going to need better players on your roster. And this is one way that you can trade. Listen, I love the value in the second round. Second round this year, incredible value pretty much throughout the entire second round. But I will say there's a good chance that the back end of the first round picks, especially these rookie wide receivers, I love Kendre Miller. I'm very high on Kendre Miller. I think there's a good chance that they do outproduce to a level where it makes sense to trade up, say, packages the 202 and the 209 for that late first this year and maybe a third next year, something to kind of try to equate value a little bit. Even if you just have to bundle those 2 seconds, I don't hate it, especially if it's a shallow start league. With all that said, I just don't rule out the trade up. Keep it on the table, keep it in your tool belt. Be ready, be prepared for whether a player is falling or not. You might just be better suited trading into a better value pool of players or better value tier that fits your team better, so on and so forth. Zach, what is your next point?
Yeah, a lot of these points, Bob, they do have overlapping elements, but they are good singular points if there's something that you haven't kept in mind. And this last one for me is just know your roster construct. We've talked about the league scoring construct, the starting format in your league, but know your roster construct and what your roster is strong at, what it is weak at, and how does that match up with the draft? Are you, say, strong at tight end and weak at running back? And the NFL draft just told us the tight ends are really pretty good. The running backs kind of suck except for the first 2. You need to go forward with that plan. And it's not always necessarily best player available if you have a need at running back. And what you can look to do at that point is trade that pick for a proven player. And this works best, Bob, when you're not on the clock. This works best beforehand. This is where the research and homework of scouting, of watching these videos, of doing mock drafts comes into play, because now you can see, I in my leagues, Bob, if I had even 106 through 112, I sold off almost everywhere. And we talked about the value in the second round. I couldn't agree with you more. That I love the value in the second round. I have acquired so many second round picks this year and moved off so many first round picks in the second half of the first round, because I kind of had that foresight that I don't love this class like everyone else. And I like the depth that you can get. Maybe you can have the value fall to you in the second round. So know the draft and how it's going to play out and how that fits with your roster. Because if you need a certain position and the NFL draft shows you that that's not a strong position, you need to get that some other way. And it's really hard to do that after the NFL draft has already told everyone that this isn't a strong position. Now, look, it was hard to see this year that running back wasn't strong.
Yeah,
it was difficult, but you did know that one running back maybe 2 was going to be elite. And then it's kind of just everyone else. Now, we didn't see what happened with Zach Charbonnet, so on and so forth. But my point remains, know how the draft's going to fall out. Have a little bit of foresight. Be willing to take a chance. And if it's not a position that you need, use that pick to trade for a player, a proven player, and capitalize on someone else's emotional FOMO, as we talked about earlier.
I love this point, and I think it ties into a point that I bring up quite frequently, is if you have this X asset that you're willing to spend, a rookie draft pick in this case, whether it's a player, whether it's a rookie draft pick, you have this asset you're willing to spend in some way. Spend it the best way you possibly can to help your team. Look for people who want to trade into this pick at that exponential value because these rookie picks are so inflated. Trade for that proven veteran talent. If you have one of those late first round picks and you need a running back, there ain't great value there. I don't hate Kendre Miller there, but I don't feel like that's a great value pick for where he's going in drafts. So I'd look to trade down, or I'd look to find some sort of package deal to get to a Najee Harris, who I think is still a pretty decent value right now, to get a Ramondre Stevenson, who is one of my favorite running back buys right now. Finding ways to, like you said, not necessarily that if, and this is more when you're in the draft versus before, like you kind of noted, but like when you're in the draft, if you have a certain need at a certain area that isn't strong where your pick is anymore, I think one of the worst things, and I meant to mention on this in my previous, or one of my previous points, is, reaching over tiers for need is terrible process. Reaching down the board, I had somebody who was asking about like drafting Chase Brown at the top of the second because he needed a running back. And because all the other ones were, and this was like a one quarterback. So for whatever that's worth, a lot more running backs are going a little earlier. But I'm like, terrible process, because I have to imagine maybe there's something still left kicking around that's better than Chase Brown at that point. But it's just a matter of don't draft for need in these drafts. You could allocate that pick to bundle that pick up to go get a Ramondre Stevenson more, and that would do far more for you, especially if you're trying to compete, than reaching miles down the board for someone like Chase Brown, who I like, but just the situation sucks right now as long as Joe Mixon is there. Absolutely, Zach. I love this point, keeping all of that in mind, that, sometimes making the best player available pick isn't always what makes the most sense. And I think that's just something that's not talked about enough or not touched on enough, is that, well, if you're on the board and you don't like what's there, best player available, look to trade out, look to take that time, look to use that clock, look to explore all options. Don't just say, well, best player available it is. Wide receiver doesn't really help me right now, but, it could probably help somebody else right now, and they could probably help my team some other way. But love this point, Zach. I love the wrap up there. So the last one I got, it's a little tic-tacky, I guess you could say, but keep an eye on your roster limits as you approach the end of your draft, especially when you have a ton of draft capital going into a draft, which most of my leagues are that way, where I've just amassed a ton of draft capital that I don't know what I'm going to do with by the end of the draft. But keeping an eye on this, you don't want to have to cut players you just drafted or players that have value. So when that happens, you need to be kind of looking to, count all of those slots, see what you have available left on your roster. And if you're at the point where you're going to have to start cutting some players, no better time to trade up or try to consolidate to next year draft capital for better draft capital. Move a third for a second next year, move a late third for a third round reroll next year type of thing, and maybe a fourth round pick on top just to get more value for trading up later in the draft next year. And just these little things is just a way to prevent you from having to cut players you shouldn't have to. Definitely keep an eye on that roster limit as the draft starts to draw to a close, because, you're just bound to lose out on value there. If you keep an eye on this stuff, because trading up, you can still get good value, consolidating two assets since you were going to have to cut one anyway. Trading up even a handful of picks is far more valuable than cutting a piece that either you just drafted or somebody you didn't want to have to cut. I'd much rather just make the trade up move or look to navigate out to next year. Just keep rolling those picks over till you need them, keep banking them. It's much more valuable to trade out a pick to next year and keep having to do that. And maybe you get that pick upgraded at some point where it's really nice. Like it goes from being a fourth, and then a few years down the road, you just keep kicking it down the road and it's eventually a second round pick. That's far more valuable than just having to cut a player. You know, when you think about the full 180 that is, and it's probably, you know, a rare case to go from a fourth all the way to a second, but it's not like it's not possible with how, you know, if say you start with a fourth, it's an early fourth. Hey man, you want to come get a guy right here? I'll take your third next year. Maybe it's a late third. All right, I'll re-roll third next year. All right, now it's a little earlier third. Maybe I can try to get a second for it. You know, and then, or you just keep rolling, re-rolling till you get that early third. Then you get a second the following year. You know what? It's better than just cutting a player outright, is all I'm saying. You might not never get to that point, but you might get to a point where you're drafting a player you really like in the third. So keep an eye on those roster limits and make sure you're making those consolidating moves one way or the other to trade out for future draft capital or trade up if you need to. Or, you know, make these little tier up moves too, where you can add a pick to a wide receiver and get a slightly better one you like a little more, whatever the case is. So, Zach, do you have anything else to touch on with this or any other closing points you want to bring up with rookie draft strategy?
Yeah, it's a good point brought up by you. I'm actually in a league where I'm kind of in this situation. But I took over an orphan team and I just unloaded everything for draft picks. And I'm in the draft. I'm like, ooh, I got a lot of picks, and I don't know. I'm gonna have to cut. And I have like 30-year-old players like Jarvis Landry on my roster. I'm probably gonna have to cut those. But things you could do. You could look to move handcuff running backs, handcuff quarterbacks. Does the Bryce Young owner want to trade a fourth-round pick for Andy Dalton? Can you move up in the fourth round by trading your late fourth and Andy Dalton, so on and so forth? Those types of things where those players may not be valuable to you, but they may be valuable to somebody else. Does the Tua owner want Mike White? And can I use that to move up into the third-round pick, so on and so forth, where you can sort of streamline your assets? Sometimes you might be in a situation where you just got to make cuts, but can you make it as minimal a hit as possible?
I love that. Instead of, some players that would be cut on most rosters. I had a few of those handcuff running back situations in a league I'm rebuilding. I tried to move them to their respectful managers, but didn't have any interest. Even tried for like fifths in 2025. Still no interest. It is what it is at that point. But trying to move those handcuffs so you don't have to cut them, or you don't have to just keep them gathering dust on your roster. Love that. And trying to get rid of any other assets that you are likely to cut. Just because you're willing to cut the players doesn't mean that should be your first go-to. If you can try to move these guys any way you can, I think it's just best process to have that due diligence and not just say, well, I don't need him, cut him. And then somebody picks him up for, 5 fab later, trade him for the $5 fab, do something, whatever you can do to get some sliver of value for a guy before you just say, nah, that's it, gonna cut the guy. Well, that is it for the video today. I do hope you all enjoyed. Please leave a like if you did. Comment down below your thoughts on the video itself. And in case you missed the exciting news, we have our very own 2023 Dynasty Rewind Rookie Draft Guide available. With this Rookie Draft Guide, you'll gain access to our film grade, player insights, and Dynasty Outlooks for every single player we believe to be fantasy relevant. On top of that, you'll receive several articles. 5 things you need to know before your draft, rookie draft trends and strategy, best rookie draft values, rookie sleepers, players to draft at your own risk, our My Guys, and a 2024 draft preview. All in all, you'll receive over 70 pages of content. The link for that draft guide will be in the pinned comment below, as well as the YouTube description box. If you enjoyed this video or any of our other content, I really hope you check it out, because I really think you're going to love what we've put together. But hey, that's going to be it for us today. We will see y'all in the next one, but until then, y'all have a good one.